As I was making my video yesterday, more information gradually came through about the earthquake that has hit Syria and Turkey. It seems that it was a particularly devastating earthquake, and that thousands of people have died and many, many more have been wounded and are affected in many ways by the effects of the earthquake, having been made homeless and having been forced into conditions when they have to rely upon the care and help of others. At the time when I was making yesterday's video, I had not fully understood the scale of the disaster that has struck these two countries. I think the first thing to say is that in these moments when one hears about an event on this enormous scale, one must think of the victims, the people who've died, their families, their friends, and the various other people who are now wounded or homeless or separated from each other. Now, I have to say that I've also seen various attempts to discuss the geopolitical importance of this event. I don't think this is the right time to discuss those. All that I will say about that is that in terms of geopolitics, the most important issue will be what, if any, effect this earthquake has on the pending Turkish elections, which are due in May. But I think, as I said, that this is not a proper moment to discuss that subject, certainly not whilst the devastation has taken place. The other thing I would say is that, of course, I hope that all countries will put aside their political differences, seek to help the people who have been affected by this earthquake in these two countries, Turkey and Syria, which have each been going through difficult times in their different ways. Syria especially has been involved in a war, and I think countries that have been conducting that war against Syria, either through support for various insurgent groups or through economic sanctions, or in many cases through both, need to put that aside and focus instead on the humanitarian relief operation that should now be underway. Anyway, this is all I'm going to say about this subject in this program. It's one I expect I will return to later and discussing its various ramifications. But as I said, for the moment, I think the only thing to do is to think about the scale of this disaster and its effect on the people who have been affected by it. And we can wait to discuss the other aspects later on as the situation on the ground hopefully begins to improve. Anyway, let me now return to this topic that has dominated my programming for the last year, which is the conflict in Ukraine. And yesterday and the day before, I discussed how it did seem to me that we are now very much in the end game in Bakhmut. And last night, a Ukrainian officer had an interview, a brief interview with the BBC. I have to admit, I didn't see the interview myself, but I've seen various reports of it. He apparently said that a third of Bakhmut, the town of Bakhmut, the actual built-up area of Bakhmut, is now under Russian control. And in fact, there have been more reports since then that the Russians have been making further inroads in the town, that they've captured more areas of it, and that the Ukrainian defenders within Bakhmut are now coming under intense pressure and are being squeezed. And there's been a whole cluster of reports about what's been going on in the various villages and settlements in and around Bakhmut. Last night, there was a report that the village of Krasnaya Gora, which is one of the northerly villages close to one of the main roads leading into Bakhmut, that the Krasnaya Gora had been fully captured by the Russians. A Russian journalist on the spot has denied that report, and he said that both Krasnaya Gora and Paraskovyevke are still either entirely or largely under Ukrainian control. However, there are also reports that the Russian forces, led perhaps by the Wagner assault forces, though Ukrainian reports now say that Russian regular troops are increasingly involved in the fighting around Bakhmut, which I suspect is true. Anyway, they report that the Russians have been bypassing these villages as they move to cut the roads. And the more reports I'm seeing, the more it seems that the claim from the British Ministry of Defence that I've just discussed previously in my previous video, that in fact the roads, the main roads leading into Bakhmut, the proper metalled surfaced roads, that they have indeed been cut, or at least they've been rendered essentially unusable, or at the very least extremely dangerous to use by the Ukrainian military, so that the supply of Ukrainian troops still in Bakhmut is now becoming extremely difficult. And I've seen more reports, this time in the Russian media, which say that the situation has now reached that point where if Ukraine wants to rescue whatever troops are left in Bakhmut, it needs to pull them out immediately, even if that involves crossing through open fields, open country, perhaps wooded areas. I'm not familiar with the local topography, but that the time for Ukraine to do that is now becoming drastically short. It may be reduced to days at most, hours more probably. Now, way back in the summer, during the fighting in Lysychansk, Ukraine did at the very last moment pull its troops out of Lysychansk. They did cross the fields. Apparently they did suffer losses whilst they were doing so, but they did, most of them at least, escape, even if they did have to leave all their heavy equipment behind them. Now, I did see film yesterday of what looked like a convoy of Ukrainian artillery being pulled out, allegedly from Bakhmut, but it was all on a road, a rather quiet road, at least there didn't seem to be much fighting near that road, and it was said to be, or at least from what I was able to understand, this film was taken near a town called Konstantinovka, which is Ukrainian controlled and which is an important base area for the Ukrainian forces in this area, but which, it must be said, is some distance from the main battle. So it may be that this convoy, which was described as artillery being pulled out of Bakhmut, it may be that this convoy has nothing to do with the garrison in Bakhmut. There are, as I've discussed previously, thousands of Ukrainian troops, perhaps even tens of thousands of Ukrainian troops, large numbers of Ukrainian military formations concentrated in the vicinity of Bakhmut, and it is possible that that convoy showed the movements of one of these units, several of which, by the way, I know are artillery brigades, and that this is not something that was being done by the actual garrison in Bakhmut itself. Well, I hope otherwise. I hope that for the sake of the people who are left in Bakhmut, Ukraine is now making that decision to pull these troops out. But I have to say that if that is the decision that Ukraine has made, it's so far and still extremely difficult to get full and precise confirmation of this. But anyway, the fact remains that Bakhmut, the Battle of Bakhmut, must now be treated as being in its very final stages. It's now a foregone conclusion that the town will fall. The only question is when. It's starting to look as if it will be days, most probably, perhaps a week, 2 weeks at the extreme outside, though I personally doubt at the moment, based on the information I'm seeing, that it will take that long. And it should be said that at the same time as the Russians are working on capturing Bakhmut, they're also working on capturing Seversk. And there's been more and more reports again have been pouring in of Russian forces capturing one village near Seversk after another as their forces push up towards Seversk. I'm not going to try and go through each and every one of these villages, but it's clear that the Russian intention is to break the Zelensky line in all its main positions, capturing Bakhmut, capturing Seversk. Solidar, of course, has already been captured. And perhaps after Bakhmut is captured, Chasiv Yar will be the next place. And this will then punch a hole through this defense line, which will be so big that it will be, I think, reasonable to say that the entire defense line, the Zelensky defense line, which Ukraine has determinedly defended since August, will have finally collapsed. Now, I have read a number of reports, especially in the Telegraph, the Daily Telegraph in Britain, that speaks of Ukraine busy trying to set up a new fortified line west of Bakhmut and presumably Chasiv Yar. And it talks about the area as being hilly, that there's, that there's hills and woods west of Bakhmut, and that this is a defendable area, and that the Russians will have more difficulty breaking through that area than they did capturing Bakhmut itself. Well, that's the reports I've seen, and it may be that these British reports are true. I, of course, have no knowledge of the local topography, and I can't say whether that is true or not. What I will say is this: the loss of Bakhmut and of the roads that connect to Bakhmut, the roads and the railways that connect to Bakhmut, it seems to me is inevitably going to complicate Ukrainian defense lines in this area of Ukraine or Donbass, because it's clear that Bakhmut acted to a great extent as the hub of the various defense lines, the transportation hub. It was the place where troops were sent and assigned to various places. It was where the supplies passed through. It was the place through which Ukraine was able to coordinate its defenses in Donbass. So maybe there are difficulties for the Russians in the topography west of Bakhmut, and maybe the advance on Kramatorsk specifically will take longer than some commentators, Big Serge, for example, have suggested. But against that, I have to say that it seems to me overall that the loss of Bakhmut will be a very, very heavy blow for Ukraine, not just a symbolic blow, but also a blow to its entire system of defense in Donbass. And as we've seen, the entire Bakhmut, Solidar, Seversk defense line seems to be in the process of collapse. And that, of course, doesn't even take into account the thousands upon thousands of troops that Ukraine has lost trying to defend Bakhmut, something that has been causing concern both to the United States and to the German intelligence service, as they've each signaled in the one case in various briefings that they've been giving to the media, the American case in the form of briefings they've been giving to the media, and in the German case in a briefing that the German intelligence agency gave to the Bundestag. So it looks to me as if, as I said, we're almost at the end in Bakhmut. We'll see whether the Ukrainians do finally pull back and accept the inevitable, and we'll see what the consequences are. But I suspect the consequences will be grave, at least from a military point of view. Now, there's been news from other parts of the battlefronts, and firstly, there were reports yesterday, again, they've not been confirmed, but they do seem to come from reliable sources, would say that the Russians have now ejected the Ukrainians from the remaining buildings on the edge of the town of Marinka, which near Donetsk city, which the Ukrainians had been clinging on to. This area, this small area of Marinka, has been a bitterly contested area over the last few weeks, but the Russians have been able to push the Ukrainians out, if these reports are true, and that, of course, is also going to weaken Ukrainian defences in two places. One is Vuhledar, because it's clear to me, and I don't quite understand how this works, but everybody seems to accept that this is so, that the defence lines between Vuhledar and Marinka are somehow connected to each other, and that if resistance collapses in one, that makes the position extremely difficult in the other, and also it brings closer the point where the Russians can start to roll up Ukrainian forces near Donetsk city, including in this larger town of Avdiivka, which is the main hub of the Ukrainian defense lines, or close to Donetsk city, and from whence the Ukrainians have been shelling Donetsk city, as they still regularly do. So it looks as if the Russians have been making more advances in that area. And by the way, the Russian Defense Minister Sergei Shoigu has said that the Russians are also successfully developing their offensive in Vuhledar itself, though he provided no details. And one can't say exactly what he means by that, whether the situation there is static, but that the Russians have brought up more artillery and are starting to put pressure on Ukrainian defense lines, or what exactly is happening there. But anyway, it does look as if the situation around Vuhledar is one which is causing the Russians, at least, to feel reasonably confident about the progress of that they're achieving in that particular part of the battlefield. Now, I think it's now largely acknowledged that the Ukrainians had to rush troops from the northern front, from the Kremenaya-Svatovo area, to try to hold the line in Vuhledar. They may have sent some troops from Bakhmut as well, as I discussed in an earlier program, but I've seen now that that is being challenged, and the claim that there's been a reduction in Ukrainian brigades in and around Bakhmut from 27 to 18, which was discussed by Bernhardt at the Moon of Alabama. Well, that may be true, but I've seen another report which suggests that there's still 24 brigade-type formations of the Ukrainian military located around Bakhmut, which suggests that there has been some redeployment of troops from Bakhmut. It is on a smaller scale than I discussed earlier. Well, I'm not sure what the facts are, and I'm not going to push this one way or the other, but it does seem that the Ukrainians did withdraw a significant amount of their forces from the Svatovo-Kremenaya area. And the Russians are clearly taking advantage of this. And just as yesterday, There were lots of reports about the Russians pushing hard in Bakhmut itself. As I said, they now are alleged to control around a third of the town itself and seem to be making significant progress, cutting off all the various roads. So it was claimed yesterday, over the course of yesterday, that the Russians are capturing or have been entering various villages and settlements, both in the Svatovo-Kremenaya area and perhaps more importantly, further north, as they seem to be pushing towards Kupiansk and towards the Oskol River. Now, to recall, this is the area where Ukraine conducted its successful counteroffensive of September and early October. And as I've said previously, if the Russians are able to reverse Ukraine's gains in that counteroffensive, that in itself will be a major psychological blow for Ukraine, over and above whatever tactical significance the recapture of all this ground would have. And I also read yesterday reports that Ukraine, having reassigned troops from this area of the battlefields to Vuhledar, to hold the line in Vuhledar, that Ukrainian troops are now thin on the ground in this more northerly area of the battlefronts, in Svatovo-Kremenaya and near Kupiansk. And supposedly, Kupiansk itself is now defended only by a single understrength brigade. Well, again, I'm not able to confirm the truth of these claims. And for the moment, I have to say that the Russian advance on Kupiansk seems to be incremental, steady, but incremental. And the same is true of the Russian push in the Svatovo-Kremenaya area. But nonetheless, the Russians are pushing forward here. And the rumour mill, and it is only a rumour mill, is perhaps understandably, therefore, in Ukraine and in Western capitals, now apparently convinced or churning out claims that it will be precisely this area, Svatovo-Kremenaya, Kupiansk, the Oskol river line, that will be the target of the next big Russian offensive. Now, that may turn out to be true, or it may not. We simply don't know. There were reports back in December that there's heavy Russian tank concentrations in this precise area of the battlefronts. But of course, it will be for the Russians to decide what they do. And I think that we can't make assumptions yet as to exactly what is happening precisely in this area of Svatovo-Kremenaya, Kupiansk, and the rest. But anyway, the overall story is of the Russians pushing Ukraine very hard on all key areas of the battlefronts. And there's also reports, by the way, of Russian reconnaissance troops crossing the border from Russia and launching patrols, carrying out aggressive reconnaissance around the northern town of Sumy in Ukraine, Sumy being not that distance from Kiev. Apparently there's also artillery exchanges that go on in this area, and the Ukrainians are clearly very nervous about some sort of operation being launched around Sumy as well, though again, whether that is indeed the Russian plan is something which we simply don't know. But anyway, lots of things going on the battlefronts, but the overall story remains the same as it's been over the last few days. The Russians pushing the Ukrainians very hard, aiming to weaken Ukraine's forces. Sergei Shoigu, the defense minister, the Russian defense minister, I noticed that in his last statement, again used the expression made famous by the area commander, Russian area commander, General Surovikin, back in September, that about grinding the Ukrainians down. That was what Shoigu said, that the Russians are grinding the Ukrainians down in all areas of the battlefronts, and that they're causing Ukraine to suffer losses. And the result is that the Ukrainians are having to shuttle their forces from one part of the battlefronts to another as they try to plug gaps in the various holes that the Russians are punching through. Now, that brings me, unfortunately and inevitably, back to the topic of losses, of casualties. This is a particularly difficult subject for me to discuss. I find that when one does talk about it, it's altogether too easy to lose sight of the fact that we're talking about human beings who've lost their lives in these battlefronts, in these battles. But nonetheless, this is a war, and one can't really discuss a war without talking about casualties. Now, there was a report yesterday that I saw, I don't know, it maybe have circulated for a while, that out of the 50,000 Wagner assault troops who have been committed to the Battle of Bakhmut, 40,000, that's 4 out of 5, are supposedly dead. Now, Brian Beletic on the New Atlas, I think it's fair to say, ridiculed that claim, and I'm going to do the same. It is based upon a fundamentally wrong premise, which I've discussed many times now in many programs, that what the Russians are doing is that they're throwing thousands of untrained men into battle in some sort of human wave tactics intended to somehow submerge the Ukrainian defenses under a tidal wave of bodies. Now, as I've also discussed in previous programs, there has never been any time in Russian military history when the Russians fought a war using such tactics. They didn't do it in the Second World War. I've discussed that at length. Russian and German military casualties on the battlefields, numbers of dead on the battlefields were roughly the same. Not the claims that the Russians suffered multiply more losses than the Germans, simply not the case. And if one goes back to previous wars, the First World War, the Russo-Japanese War, the Crimean War, the Napoleonic Wars, there's never been an instance when the Russians have been profligate with their manpower in that kind of manner. It's simply not the way the Russians fight their wars. And in fact, there's been lots of film and reports showing how Wagner fighters have conducted their fighting in Bakhmut. And the overall impression, the overwhelming impression that has been gleaned from these pictures is that the fighters themselves are well trained. They know how to use their equipment. Larry Johnson, on one of our live streams, former CIA analyst, spoke about this. They are well-trained troops who know their business. So this idea that the Russians are sending convicts, throwing away the lives of convicts in the kind of fashion that Russians supposedly do in human wave tactics, that has absolutely no basis in reality at all. Speaking of which, I have to say that it's not clear anyway what proportion of Wagner manpower is in fact made up by convicts. They do account for a part of it, but it's probably a misunderstanding that most of these people who fight in the Wagner organization are ex-convicts, and that's just an assumption that the Western media makes, and we should not, I think, fall into the trap of treating assumptions as facts. Anyway, regardless, the figures for Russian losses in the battles of Bakhmut, I'm sure, have little connection to reality. What about Ukrainian losses? And here, I'm afraid, one has to wrestle with two pieces of information that have just appeared. The one is a claim that General Zelensky, the chief of the General Staff of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, made a report to General Milley, the chairman of the US Joint Chiefs of Staff, in which supposedly he gave numbers for Ukraine's losses, and these are, well, somewhere north of 150,000 dead and large numbers of wounded. And shortly after, an article appeared in a Turkish newspaper that basically repeated these figures, attributed them to Mossad. They said that Mossad, Israel's intelligence service, has been able to tabulate these Ukrainian losses, and it gave very similar figures to the ones that Milley is supposed to have given to, Zelensky is supposed to have given to Milley, and as I said, it attributed them to Mossad. I have to say that I'm a little wary about this story from the Turkish media. In fact, about both stories. Neither is confirmed, neither is based on any open source material. And I have to say this, I think it's unlikely that Mossad would be briefing the Turkish authorities, let alone the Turkish media, about Ukrainian losses. It could be that Ukraine, which maintains good relations with Turkey, has been providing Turkey with information about its losses, and that the Turkish authorities decided that this was a good moment to leak that information, and they did it through this Turkish newspaper, but to give themselves diplomatic cover, they pretended that the information had come from Mossad. That's a possibility. I wouldn't discount it, but it's possible. And this is the thing that people need to remember, that these figures are made up of a combination of guesswork and a recycling of stories. So Douglas Macgregor, Colonel Douglas Macgregor, who does have sources in the Pentagon, he was, after all, at one point a very senior Pentagon official, and I'm sure he's very well connected, has been giving similar figures for Ukrainian losses as those that Zelensky is supposed to have given to Milley. And I do wonder, perhaps, whether these reports about Zelensky having briefed Milley and given these sort of numbers, and the Turkish story might simply be a recycling, a case of people recycling Douglas Macgregor's numbers and attributing them to different sources, in which case all that we're seeing is the same story, in effect, going around in circles and apparently corroborating itself. So I have to add that big word of caution. I would say that the Turkish newspaper also gives very careful, precise breakdowns for the numbers of armoured vehicles, helicopters, drones, tanks, aircraft that Ukraine has lost as well. And that does give this story perhaps an appearance of accuracy. But again, I have to say that I have learnt in the past that circumstantial detail, though it can look impressive, is not necessarily proof of the accuracy of any particular claim. So I'm going to take all of this with a huge amount of caution, but I would say this, that 157,000 dead soldiers would not be out of line with calculations, far out of line with calculations and assessments that others have carried out using various methodologies of the levels of Ukrainian losses since the start of this war. And that doesn't necessarily make these claims true, but one does start to wonder whether they might be true, given that the same figures repeat themselves, only increase, and given that the Pentagon itself was saying only a few weeks ago that Ukrainian losses were somewhere in the region of 100,000. And of course, a few weeks ago, also the EU Commission President, Ursula von der Leyen, briefly said the same thing. So that's the first thing to say. It does look as if Ukraine is indeed taking very heavy losses. And we also see the latest mobilization that Ukraine is conducting. Now, I've been careful, I've been wary about discussing this mobilization up to now. There's been a mass of pictures, photos, films now, very large numbers of these pictures and films of Ukrainian men being press-ganged into the Ukrainian army on the streets, given their summonses on the streets. There was even one claim of a farcical episode in which two Ukrainian conscription groups, people tasked with rounding up soldiers to send them to the battle lines, that they each tried to conscript the other. Well, I don't know whether that's true or not, but it's the kind of story that is circulating. And, of course, a couple of days ago, there was a report in The Guardian which also said that there was talk, use the word, talk of this sort of thing happening. Now, I've never seen anything like that happen in Russia at any point over the course of this war. I've never seen film or photographs or pictures or reports of people being rounded up in that kind of the way to Russia. And I can't help but think that if this sort of thing were going on in Russia, we would by now know about it. I mean, there would be film of it, there would be people who would have taken film on their mobile phones, that it would have been uploaded in some way, that something like this would have circulated. But it does seem to be coming out of Ukraine. And it is undoubtedly the case that the Ukrainian government is lowering the standard of the men that it now conscripts. It's reduced the age at which people have to register for conscription to 16. To stress, that doesn't mean that they're conscripted at 16. It means that they must register at that age, which, however, might make it difficult for them to leave Ukraine since they are registered for conscription. But anyway, they've done that. They've also apparently increased the age limits to around 60 of the men that can be conscripted into the battle. And there's also now more and more reports that people with various infirmities and disabilities, provided they can fight, that they are also being conscripted too. And there's also reports that women are being conscripted as well on an ever greater scale. Now, we saw similar things happen during the summer at around the time of the fighting in Severodonetsk, Lysychansk. And at that time, I did think that this suggested that there was a manpower crisis in Ukraine. And in fact, I discussed that in programs. It seemed to me that men were being thrown into battle, badly trained, and there were clear pictures then of elderly men in their 50s, even in one or two cases in their 60s, being sent into battle. And I found that both cruel and disturbing. And there were also reports of rather brutal conscription practices being applied in Ukraine then. And of course, as it turned out, Ukraine actually held back some of its younger reservists, and they were trained up, and they were then thrown into the battle in places like Kharkiv region and Kherson region, and they successfully conducted the offensives there. And far from Ukraine having manpower difficulties in the summer, it was Russia that did. Russia saw many of the contract soldiers return to civilian life after their contracts expired, and obviously it had also suffered some losses. And one way or another, by the end of the summer, the Russian military in Ukraine was heavily outnumbered by the Ukrainian. Well, I have to say that that does make me a bit more cautious about these pictures of this brutal roundup of reservists that's going on in Ukraine today. But it does seem to me on an order of magnitude greater in scale than what I was seeing back in the summer. And I also get the impression that though Ukraine is trying to hold some troops back, it is trying to build up at least 3 brigades, 3 additional brigades, with all this Western equipment it's going to be getting, that it's finding it more and more difficult to find men in the meantime, even these older, weaker, more infirm, less well-trained men than it did earlier in the war, and that its manpower advantage over Russia has now probably irretrievably gone. And that may point to something else, which is that with this army, this Ukrainian army, constantly shuttling around on the battlefronts, firefighting in one place after another, with men apparently in short supply, with casualties very high, it does look as if it must be the case that some of these troops must be getting very tired and increasingly demoralized. Now, there's been a number of reports. I remember a few weeks ago, talking about how Ukraine's army was becoming exhausted. There was a report in The Guardian a few days ago, which I covered on this channel, about how Ian Duncan Smith, an important British MP, has apparently written to British Prime Minister Rishi Sunak expressing concern about the number of Ukrainian soldiers who are now committing suicide. The article didn't give figures for this, but clearly it's a problem. And that same article also wondered whether Ukraine's army, under this constant stress that it is now under, and with its numbers falling, whether it can maintain its morale and continue fighting in the way that it is if the war continues for much longer, right through 2023. Now, the contrast here is with the Russians, because all this fighting that's been going on in Bakhmut, in Vuhledar, in Zaporozhye region further east, in Kremenaya Svatovo, in Kupiansk, it's all been carried out essentially by the same units that the Russians have had on the battlefields throughout the war. I've discussed this before, but the big new additional Russian forces committed to the front since the September call-up have not yet been committed in any big way to the battle. So Ukraine does seem to be experiencing increasing manpower problems. It does seem that its army is becoming increasingly tired. There is apparently issues of demoralization, as Ian Duncan Smith's warnings to Rishi Sunak suggests, whereas the Russians probably now have a numerical advantage, and their troops who've been training and building up are fresh. They haven't yet been committed to the battle. And I would have thought that is going to be a decisive factor in the fighting over the next few months. Anyway, that's where we are on the battlefields. There's been much less news on the political issues. The purge that I discussed yesterday in Kiev, the sacking of the defense minister, Mr. Reznikov, has now happened. It does seem as if Kirill Budanov will be his successor. There's uncertainty about whether Reznikov has any role in the Ukrainian political system. I suspect probably the answer is no, but we'll just have to wait and see. There's been recrimination in the European Union that information about President Zelensky's trip to Brussels, apparently prospective leak to Brussels, was leaked, and one wonders why that happened and what that all was about. But perhaps the most enlightening comments about the war, I say enlightening rather than insightful, have been made by Mr. Guterres, the Secretary General of the United Nations. Now, he has, as far as I can see, taken a fairly consistent pro-Ukrainian, pro-Western line about this war, much to Russian and private annoyance. He is, after all, supposed to be impartial. But anyway, put that aside. He's spoken to the General Assembly of the United Nations. He said that he sees no sign of a peace agreement anytime soon. He says that both sides seem to be committed to continuing the war. I think that's a reasonable interpretation of events. But he also said that the war seemed to be escalating, that there was a real possibility of it expanding. Not entirely sure what he meant by that. And he talked about how instead of the world drifting into a possible larger conflict, he didn't actually say World War III, contrary to what some reports suggest, but he did seem to hint at something not far short of that. Anyway, he said that instead of the world drifting into that larger conflict with its eyes shut, it seemed to be walking there wide awake. Well, I would agree with that, but I think Mr. Guterres needs to be a little bit more forthcoming if he's going to make those sort of claims about who exactly he thinks is responsible for this. After all, there were negotiations in March to try to bring this conflict to an end. There doesn't seem to be any doubt that the Russians were acting in good faith over the course of those negotiations. There's been no suggestions, no serious suggestions. Otherwise, the negotiations failed after an outline agreement was reached in Istanbul at the end of March. Either the Ukrainians were stringing the Russians along, as their former intelligence chief, Kirill Budanov, now likely to be defense minister, is claiming, or, as I personally still believe, and as the Israeli Prime Minister, former Prime Minister Mr. Bennett, has again reiterated, those negotiations were sabotaged by the actions of the Western powers, primarily Britain and the United States. So that was an opportunity to achieve peace, and it was thrown away, and it was not the fault of the Russians. And if we're talking about expanding the war, well, the thing that is causing this war both to continue and to expand have been Western arms supplies and this constant mantra that we've been hearing from the West, that the West will support Ukraine for as long as it takes, though it's never clear exactly what that means. Now, absent that, had there been serious efforts to try to negotiate, there'd been a realistic assessment of Ukraine's prospects in this war, we would surely not be in a position now where we would need to worry about what Mr. Guterres is saying about us all drifting open-eyed into a much bigger, greater conflict. So I think Mr. Guterres needs to be, as I say, a bit more upfront about who has obstructed negotiations up to this point and who, through their arms supplies, have been sustaining the war. Having said that, it's now starting to look as if these arms supplies are starting to dwindle. Brian Beletic, in his latest video analysing the latest US defence package, pointed out that the latest, that it came in two lists. One list was of weapons that are going to be immediately provided to Ukraine. These are US weapons. The other is of US weapons which will be eventually supplied to Ukraine when they have either been refurbished or made. And Brian Beletic pointed out quite rightly that the list of weapon systems that are going to be provided to Ukraine now is becoming very, very thin indeed. That the United States is no longer saying how many Javelin missiles, how many 155mm artillery shells, how many HIMARS rockets it's going to supply to Ukraine, obviously because the numbers are becoming embarrassingly low. And though we do see proposals or contracts or declarations that other weapons, like these, rocket-launched guided bombs that are supposed to be launched from HIMARS launchers, those will be supplied in due course. For the moment, they haven't been manufactured. In relation to this latest weapon, the rocket-powered guided bomb, as Brian Beletic says, not only has this weapon not been manufactured for Ukraine, it has never been manufactured at all. Even simple weapons usually experience teething problems. Anything, when it's made for the first time, experiences teething problems. There has to be a test program. There has to be work done to iron out the various glitches that inevitably exist in any new type of weapon system. This could be, in my experience, at least I'm talking now about the kind of civilian industrial products that I'm familiar with, and can be quite a protracted business, and I can't imagine it's going to be different from a weapon system like this, which has never been made before and never been used in combat in any situation. Usually, this sort of thing takes years. Apparently, in this case, it's supposed to be done within a few weeks or months. Now, I appreciate that it involves mating together to well-established pieces of equipment, the rocket and the bomb. But having said that, even that, in my experience, judging, as I said, from what I know from civilian manufacturing, even that tends to be a rather more complex task than one might suppose. and then is often assumed. I can see all kinds of problems, and I do wonder whether if the intention really is to get these rocket-propelled guided bombs to Ukraine by the summer, whether the Ukrainians are going to get lots of defective, poorly tested, poorly built bombs that could be as dangerous for them as they are for the Russians that they're launched at. And besides, anyway, it's likely that there being no manufacturing capacity to build these systems, it's going to take several weeks or months for production, for the mating of these two weapon systems to be done in sufficient quantity to make a difference. So, this is just one example of the problems, and there's going to be lots of others. And I've already talked at length about the tanks. There's actually an unintentionally hilarious video. I say hilarious, I found it so, in which a British soldier who was involved in maintaining Challenger 2 tanks in the field takes apart various claims about the simplicity of operating Challenger 2 tanks, British Challenger 2 tanks in Ukraine, made by a senior British officer who I believe to be, though he's never named in this video, none other than our old friend Hamish de Breton Gordon, he who thinks that the tank, operating the tank, is going to be apparently as straightforward, well, as, PlayStation stuff. I'm overstating things there a little. But anyway, this soldier, whose, as I said, job it was to maintain the tanks, the Challenger 2 tanks, foresees all kinds of problems in keeping them running on Ukrainian battlefields. And though he is extremely careful to remain neutral about the war, and says many complimentary things about Ukrainian soldiers and Ukrainian technicians, it's clear that he's worried about how these tanks are actually going to perform. So, Mr. Guterres, worried about the war being prolonged. It's been prolonged and enlarging because of weapons supplies from the West, which are starting to run down. And the Germans, I've already discussed how they're upset about the fact that European countries are not coming forward with the large numbers of Leopard 2 tanks that were being talked about. They've seemed to have hit on the expedient of supplying Leopard 1 tanks instead. Brian Boletic thinks that these Leopard 1 tanks are envisaged as operating less like tanks and more like assault guns. He may be right. I have to say, I'm much more sceptical about this. It looks to me like a stopgap, an improvisation. Germany's now committed to supplying tanks to Ukraine. Olaf Scholz would be in severe political trouble if tanks in some numbers fail to appear. He can't get all the Leopard 2s that he was expecting, so he's sending Leopard 1s instead. I think that's all there is to it. Anyway, the net result of all of this is, as I said, Ukraine is being supplied with a hodgepodge, a confusing, chaotic hodgepodge of weapons. It's receiving promises of weapons that some of which haven't even been designed or at least built yet, and which are perhaps conceptually sound, but are untested, even in industrial terms, let alone in military terms. And I've noticed that perhaps in light of this, there's more and more concerns about where this war is going. Now, I've discussed the various reports that have been appearing, the Rand Corporation report, the CSIS report, the IMF report about the state of the Russian economy. I noticed that General Stavridis, who I believe was a senior US military officer, very senior US military officer, if memory serves me rightly, he was at one point chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He is talking about a stalemate war in Ukraine, which is very different from the victory that people were talking about, Ukrainian victory over Russia that people were talking about just a few weeks ago. So there's clearly some attempt underway to lower expectations, but one way or the other, it doesn't seem to me as if the situation is at all good. And I think that Mr. Guterres, if he's honest with himself, he will understand that it is the Western powers that have been responsible principally for enlarging and prolonging this war, and with their promises to Ukraine increasingly failing to become real. Perhaps it's time that he did his job and started having serious discussions with their leaders, the leaders of the West, first and foremost perhaps the British and the Americans, but also, of course, the Europeans, had a word in their ear and said to them that the time has now come to open negotiations directly with the Russians. Just saying, we'll see whether he does that. That, it seems to me, is the job of the Secretary General of the United Nations. Perhaps it's time, actually, in my opinion, it's long overdue that Mr. Guterres started to do it. Thank you for joining me for this program today. Be more from me soon. Let me remind you again that all our videos appear on multiple platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, Odyssey, Rockfin, and Telegram. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. Links under this video. Also, don't forget to check out our shop. Get yourself the great things that appear there, our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, and all those great things. And last but not least, please remember, if you've liked this video, to click the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Well, that's me for today. More from me soon. Probably lots more news from the battlefronts tomorrow.